I think everything about the Ukraine war has worked out horribly for the Chinese. We now have an insurance ban on maritime shipments of any Russian crude, including things that originate in the Far East, nowhere near the war.
Mm.
So, and the Western techs that have made the eastern half of the Russian energy sector viable over the last 20 years, they're all gone. The Russians don't know how to operate those fields. So the Chinese are looking at a midterm reduction, massive reduction in the ability to import crude and other raw
Hmm.
commodities from the Russian space at all. They now know that the idea that this war would be a cakewalk is foolish, because not only have the Taiwanese been preparing for the war for 70 years, they have a moat. And the idea that sanctions and especially boycotts can just come out of nowhere and hit things up into your central bank. I mean, this cuts to the core of the entirety of the Chinese development model. So everything that they thought they were going to be able to walk away with, they now know is not a possibility. And then at the top, you've got this one dude who no longer even has a cadre of smart people that he can send in the other room with some beer and pizza to come up with another plan.
Yeah.
So they're just slamming their head into the wall with their ideology until something cracks, and it's cracking. Every time the United States does something that, on a financial point of view, other countries are annoyed by, this conversation bubbles up again. This has been happening back and back and back since the 1980s. And every single time, the dollar becomes more central. So the
Mhm.
big shift this time around is that the Japanese and the Europeans both basically sublimated their own sanctions program to the US Fed and the US dollar. So they have seen a significant reduction in their global use over the course of the last few months, and the dollar has just gone up and up and up. The only currency swap trades that we have that are of any substance, and there's still less than 2% of the value of trade, is between Russia and China direct. But again, the Chinese don't want rubles and the Russians don't want yuan. The only reason this is working a little bit better this time is when the boycott of the Russian central bank kicked in, about the only foreign currency that the Russians had on hand at home was yuan. So it's really their only option to a certain degree. But they're actually using gold more.
Yeah.
They're flying planes of gold to pay for imports right now. Let me try. Uh, the problem has always been scale. Most countries in most parts of the world for most of history are very easy to disrupt. They don't have secure borders. They don't have everything they need within their own borders. So they can try to make incremental progress in this, that, or the other thing. But whenever there's a war or a boycott or a famine, it all falls apart. What the US fundamentally changed was, because the North American continent has been secure for us for 150 years, we never had to worry about those resets. Even decades like the Great Depression, we exited the decade stronger than we entered it. And that meant that when the United States did decide to get involved with the world as a stabilizing force, we could kind of export that stability. And by making global transport on the ocean safe and cheap for everyone, we could finally have, instead of these hundreds of separate discriminatory economies, all kind of merge into a single global whole. Excuse me, into a single global whole. And that had never happened before in human history. I mean, the closest analog would probably be the Roman Empire, but this is an age before steamships, so you're not moving too fast. And from that, everything suddenly changed, because that meant that everyone could specialize in whatever they did best. So the Koreans went into toys, into heavy industry, and ultimately into semiconductors. The Chinese went into mass manufacturing. So did San Antonio. In terms of energy, places that normally wouldn't be stable enough to support a population because there was no food production could export crude and import food. And that led them to produce more crude and start refining it. So every little bit of the system became fine tuned for what they did best. My home state of Iowa stopped producing wheat and beef. That all moved to the drier climates of the Great Plains. We started doing soy and swine. Everybody's value added increased. And if you do that for 70 years, you get the world that we know.
Mhm.
What's happening now is that single hole is breaking down. And so we now have to retrace every single economic sector and see what it looked like before this grand merger started in the 1950s. And in most parts of the world, it means reverting back to not just something that existed pre 1945, but something pre industrial. because a lot of the technologies that are required to do mass agriculture or manufacturing or finance can be imported, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily mastered. And if you can't keep your own supply chain and input system sustainable within whatever countries you can reach in a post-globalized system, then you just can't play. And so we're going to see, for example, a lot of Russian crude fall off the market. We're going to see a lot of Brazilian soy fall off the market. We're going to see Chinese manufacturers fall off the market. And we're all going to have to learn to do things differently or get by without. In the case of North America, it's a differently thing. And we're already, courtesy of Donald Trump, surprisingly well on our way. It would take the United States re-engaging a large number of countries and to rebuild something like the original globalization deal at Bretton Woods. We subsidize your economic systems in exchange for control of your security apparatus. But I'm not sure that's possible anymore. You'd have to spook the main threats to being a part of it, or convince everyone else that the Chinese and the Russians are the main threats, because that's how the US sees that. You'd have to be on our security program.
Right.
But I don't think it's possible anymore. It was one thing to subsidize the global system in 1946. There wasn't a global system.
Right.
But we've had 100 odd countries grow explosively in the time since then, especially since 1992. And we've retooled our military that I'm not sure even if we could get buy-in that we could still do it. So during the Cold War, we had the Reagan Navy, as it was called at the end, where we had hundreds of ships that were patrolling the global oceans, and there were no real counter navies. The two largest navies in the world outside of our own were Japan and the UK, and they were allies. That's not where we are anymore. We have retooled our military to be country smashers. So we just floated the Ford. That's the most powerful military platform we've ever had. All by itself, it can take on any but 7 of the world's largest air forces. That's if you're fighting fair, and the Navy does not fight fair. Carriers move. That's the idea. You choose when the fight happens. So really just the top 3, one of which is ours. We're going to have 4 of those, in addition to the 10 Nimitz. This is how you destroy a country. That's not how you patrol the global oceans. You need destroyers for that. You need hundreds of them, maybe at least 800. We have 70. Half of them are defending the carriers. So we don't even have the military theoretical capability of rebuilding things like we did back in the 50s and the 60s. The Navy we have right now is actually, I would argue, right-sized for our economic and strategic needs. It's only if you want to become the global policeman again that we need to change it. And I don't think there's a lot of support for that right now. I think that's the low case, unfortunately. I think that's the best case scenario at this
Super
point.
optimistic.
Yeah, well, we're seeing it with the Ukraine war. The global fertilizer distribution system is already breaking down. So in the United States, we've already had substantial crop switching away from food crops into things like hay. And in the rest of the world, they're just using less fertilizer. So we won't have a good idea for just how big the global shortage is going to be until probably the second week of September. That's when we usually get our first big estimates for most of the Northern Hemisphere's planting. And that's just the start of this, because it takes 3 years to rebuild a nitrogen or a phosphate supply chain system, and 10 years for potash. So, whatever we are facing in September, that's the beginning, at least 3 years of that, probably a lot more. And in the case of Brazil, they were luckily able to surge their imports of fertilizer, but then it just stopped. So they have enough for this season, but nothing for next. And that's the world's 3rd largest exporter.